Sam Whitfield, welcome to Suit of the Podcast.
Terrence, it's great to be here, and you're looking quite dapper today, sir. And
Thank you.
I know it's a Friday, but I decided to throw on everyone's favorite blazer of mine.
It looks
Uh,
fantastic. I am very much I like the camel brown khaki style. I have like four, not blazers, but like just khaki jackets. And the joke is that every time I walk into a clothing store, I'm like, oh, but where's the khaki? Because I think like we're the same in the adventure vibe. The more like we can integrate it into our day-to-day lives, the better.
yeah, well, I can't remember where you live, but I live in Florida.
Yeah.
So where I'm at, wearing suits here is weird because
hmm
we actually do have a winter time here, like in January. So it does get cold here. That's kind of the misconception. So
hmm
I do have like two tweed blazers that I love
Ooh,
to wear.
nice.
But I only wear them maybe once or twice a year here. And then it's really hard to like find like blazers here that are like stylish, like not
hmm
cheap looking leisure suits, but like
Yeah.
also are okay with the weather. So I find that yeah, but brown, camel hair. Shout out to Banana Republic too
Yes.
uh
Seriously.
for this blazer. So
Okay, I think every time I see we have a mall nearby. I live in the Midwest, so this I can wear pretty much anything all year round, which is nice, except for like
yeah.
the 5 hot days of the year and then the coldest days of the year. But we have a Banana Republic in our mall nearby, and every time I see it, I'm like, I'm a really a Banana Republic guy. When I see their ads and it's like aviation from the 1920s is like where all of the models are standing around, they're wearing linen. I'm like, yes, this is my vibe.
Yeah. What's really funny too here is like we'll get the ads for Banana Republic, and it'll be like Arctic, adventure, like guy wearing a really down blazer, and it's like that's really nice. But even if I had the money to afford that jacket, like there's no way I could justify buying this to wear in Florida. So like unless I go to like Alaska or
hmm
somewhere,
You have to go on a Klondike adventure. That's really what it is, Sam. This is the universe telling you through targeted advertising. Go north, young man.
I actually did go on a cruise to Alaska when I was my senior year going into high school, and
Oh, cool.
it was fun. That was like 12 plus years ago, but we still talk about that cruise just because it was so much fun. So,
Do you have like a favorite travel location that you'd like to revisit besides Alaska?
well, I'm going to New York City in the spring actually.
Nice.
New York. Yeah, I've been to New York like 6 times and
hmm
never gets old.
hmm
So,
Uh,
that's
work has had me out there a handful of times, and every time I
yeah.
go, I'm like, I can tell I live in the Midwest because I'm like, why are there all these people everywhere at once? But the architecture, the locations, you've used New York City as the backdrop in a couple of your stories, and it works really well because so much of it's like the whole city lends itself to narrative.
I mean, yeah, I mean it does for just so many stories too. And I'm not someone who is like I know authors who are like really, they're like really keen on like specific locations
hmm
for, various places and I'm like I wish I were that good with detail, but I'm like I can barely remember where like the streets, in my own place
hmm
or let alone, somewhere I'm not familiar with. So, but
hmm
yeah, New York definitely is, you know, a great place for, stories. So is, Tampa actually,
hmm
which is
I'm
kind of where I'm
glad
at.
that you've incorporated Tampa into I'd read, I think it's Blood Ties is the first of that collection, correct?
Yeah.
The that you incorporate the Tampa elements into it because I really don't think that people appreciate enough how Florida sits in this unique location that actually lends itself really well to crime. and to organized crime specifically because of the ports. Like it's the same reason New York it works. It's because there's stuff coming in and out, and that fact alone means it's really easy for someone to muscle in and go, well, if you want this stuff to make it to its destination, you're going to help. You're going to pay.
The thing that drives me crazy, and I'm not even originally like from Florida. I'm originally from Colorado, but I've
Hmm.
lived in Florida my entire adult life. And the thing that drives me crazy is like people because of Hollywood and whatnot, I
Hmm.
they think that Florida is just Miami.
Yes.
And they also think that Miami is like really, glamorous, and it can be in certain parts, but like I've only been to Miami twice, and like that's an area where you don't necessarily you want to be careful because like
Yes.
yeah, like there are some like really nice areas, but like there are also some areas, just like everywhere else where you really need to be,
Careful.
careful. You don't want to be walking around, you don't want to be walking down at night, otherwise, one of the gangs might,
Hmm.
so
The roads are also like just this is what happens if you travel enough. You really start getting picky on interstates or the city traffic.
yeah.
Miami's traffic is nightmarish. I would rather drive in Chicago and potentially New York than
Yeah.
Miami, just for the record. It's just not as much fun, which I know I'm literally meandering down a side tangent on this, but I always feel very strongly about it. Trying to roll back here, you've also got a new book coming out,
I
Night of the Vigilante. What can you tell us about it?
Well, I appreciate you giving me the opportunity to plug. So, Night of the Vigilante is the for it's not really a direct sequel.
Hmm.
So, I have this series called The Shadows of Deception Saga, which is kind of like my love letter to the spy, genre. It's kind of like my American take on James Bond. And
Hmm.
my main character in that series is John Ryder,
Hmm.
who's kind of like my American James Bond. But in book two, I introduced a side character named Jason Miller.
Hmm.
And initially, I was going to I was just going to cast him as like a side character. He was kind of going to be my excuse to have John Ryder, my main character. He was going to be John Ryder's handler to get into Mexico and fight the cartels. And I was initially going to kill him off in one of the books, and then beta readers like they really liked the character, so I fleshed him out a bit, and I kind of gave him. I'm a huge Clint Eastwood fan, and
Hmm.
I'm a big fan of the Man with No Name character.
Hmm.
But unlike our mutual friend Terrence McCauley, I'm
Hmm.
not really good at writing classical westerns like he
Hmm.
is. So I'm like, well, what if I did like a modern day take on the Man with No Name character? And oh, that Jason Miller character might be perfect for it. So I really kind of started to flesh out the Jason Miller character, and I basically took my initial cartel story that I had planned for John Ryder, and I
Ah.
made it Jason Miller's origin story
Hmm.
instead. So I don't really know. Like people have asked me, is it a prequel to Shadows of Deception? Is it a sequel? And it's kind of like, well, it's kind of both because John Ryder's not the main character. He does show up in this
Hmm.
one, but it's kind of like a spin-off, I guess.
Hmm. It's a part of the greater universe of Sam Whitfield,
Yes,
which
it's part of the Ryderverse
the Riderverse.
as I'm
It
now branding it.
it reminds me a little of like how Elmore Leonard writes in some ways
Yes.
because he has like a I was going to use a word that I realize if I say it wrong, it sounds like colonoscopy. A panoply of characters that he actually has like pop up here and there
Yeah.
in this whole universe. Like again, I think that he'd be a good example of someone that writes in a location very well, but he he has stories that just like two or three mentions of this one person name, and then they show up in another book later. So I think it's
Yeah.
cool that you're doing that because, correct me if I'm wrong, this is also a character that's in Blood Ties, and that made me very excited when I saw it.
No, so the interesting thing is I am glad that you brought up Elmore Leonard because he is an influence of mine.
Hmm.
Um, so Blood Ties is kind of like a different universe from
Okay.
Shadows of Deception and the Riderverse, completely, but kind of I guess some similar things. But yeah, no. I think I mean Elmore Leonard is just I got into him later on, like when I
Hmm.
was in college. And I started writing more seriously because I was a big fan
Hmm.
of Justified, the show.
Yes. Such a
And
good show.
and then I remember Quentin Tarantino, who was also like a huge influence on me stylistically, talking about Elmore Leonard and what an influence you know, he was on him. So I'm like, oh, I'll have to check this guy out more. And so I was kind of like, yeah, I'll see how. It wasn't like a conscious decision, but I guess I kind of incorporated his style
Hmm.
into both Blood Ties and Shadows of Deception. So it's not really like a.
Hmm.
They're not really connected, but the influence is definitely there for both of them.
Hmm.
So
I love how Leonard's writing. I never like I'd heard of Get Shorty, and because of course it stars the great Danny DeVito in it,
right,
and I'd never seen the movie, but I saw just like a half price books, the copy of Get Shorty. I'm like, okay, I'll give it a read. There was like a huge pile of Elmore Leonard books. I finished Get Shorty. I came back and took virtually every one of those Elmore Leonard books because I was like, wow, this is fascinating. Because I had seen Justified and it didn't click until like, I don't know, 15-ish years later. Oh my goodness, I'm that old. That this was based on books.
right.
And I think that he is one of those examples of like writing good crime fiction that has a pulp edge to it without being too pulpy.
Yeah, the other another big influence on me, and I love his work, but he's kind of like a very he's kind of very niche. Like you have to be prepared from his is James Elroy, who wrote
Mm,
LA Confidential.
yes.
He was also an influence, but I mean, James Elroy's books are like 800 pages long, which is not something that I'm into as a writer. I
Hmm.
like, to bang them out quickly and you know, not I wouldn't just really say quickly, but I want something that people can read in like a
Hmm.
weekend.
Yes.
And yeah, it's kind of hard to do that for Elroy. And the other thing too is um Elroy's work is very vulgar, and he
Hmm.
uses vulgarity in a way that like it works for the story. It's not over the top,
Hmm.
but he does things that like I'm not so sure that like I could get away
Yeah.
with as, an author. I appreciate, his style, but even so, like, yeah, there are just things that I couldn't get
Hmm.
away with.
Yeah.
So
Speaking of that, I am curious. Do you have a preference on, w- do you prefer reading longer books or books that are a nice, tight, sub 200 pages?
well, it's funny, both as a reader and as an author, like now that I'm working in, as an adult, I prefer the sub 200. Like I
Hmm.
like the Ian Fleming not Bond novels are like the
Perfect length.
perfect length
Hmm.
because, there's enough to go there, but yet like, it's not going to take me 6 months to get through, one, unless I'm like really busy or something. But
Hmm.
yeah,
Fleming, I think, is like a perfect example of good fiction doesn't need to take too long. He has good plots. You just move right along. And like, I'm a big fan of Hard Case Crime. A lot of those books don't last more than 200 pages. anytime a book starts to just creep up past 300 pages, that's when I'm like, I need to really be committed to this story to finish
Yeah.
it.
Well, also,
Which is
so
ironic. My favorite book is Kai Crystal, which is like a huge, massive 800 page plus book, and I love it.
yeah.
I go through it every year, but that's like the exception. Everything else,
Well,
it's like you don't need to be Dumas and you don't need to be Victor Hugo. You can write it doesn't need to be War and Peace.
going back to James Elroy, one of my all-time favorite novels is American Tabloid, which
Hmm.
is his big it's his big book on the Kennedy assassination. And I mean, I love that book, but even in like audiobook form,
Hmm.
that's like a 26-hour book, and I read it or I listen to it like every other year, and it's a great book, but it'll take me like a couple months. And um I guess like as a writer, one of the things I'm a technical writer by trade
Hmm.
actually. And one of the things that I guess I was kind of I guess trained, in college was, you know, get to the point,
Yes.
and summarize as quick as you can. And that's for business stuff, but like as when I started writing like more seriously, even fiction, I was like, okay, why do I have to like
Hmm.
what rule is there that says that, the novel has to be, 500 pages
Yeah.
or something? Because I feel like I'm gonna, end up like adding in a whole bunch of filler
Hmm.
chapters, which I'm not into. So
Hmm.
it might make the book look better on the shelf with lots of pages, but it's not necessarily going to be great for a reading audience. So,
I when we had David Darling on the podcast to talk about the Egyptian Enigma, the thing that impresses me greatly is the Egyptian Enigma is a decent sized book. I can't remember how many pages it is. It might be around that 300, 350.
yeah.
And so it's just a little bit longer than my usual reading preference, but it just reads like a breeze. And he constantly keeps momentum moving and he's constantly got something going on. And I'm very impressed when a writer can do that. Personally,
Yeah.
I don't think that I can sustain a plot longer than 200 pages. And if I try, it's going to end up being more like when you see in a movie where there's that whole extra third act that didn't need to be there. Sorry, the fourth and fifth acts that didn't need to be there. The Batman. And
Yeah.
I, I just want a clean, give me an adventure that starts, middle, end, in and out.
Yeah, so you mentioned Blood Ties since I know that's the one you really, read. The interesting thing about Blood Ties is that I didn't initially intend that to be a whole collection, but I
Hmm.
was writing I think it was book 3 of the Shadows of Deception saga that I had just finished. And I released that like in August. No, I released that in July.
Hmm.
And I was I was going to work on book 4, and I had been writing Night of the Vigilante as well. And at one point I was just kind of like burnt
Yeah.
I was just kind of burnt out because I had been writing political thrillers just for like 2 years at that point, and so I'm like,
Hmm.
well, I'm gonna write something different. So
Hmm.
I started writing like, short kind of crime fiction, these short stories. And like eventually I had like 5 of them, and I was just like, I remember I submitted one to our mutual friend Luke Gossage, and he's like,
Hmm.
you should put this in like a compendium or something. So I was like, that's a good idea. So I did that and put it in with like 4 of the other Blood Ties stories. And I released that like in November, which is not the best time, I
Hmm.
think, to really like push books out there. But I was kind of like, well, the Dogs Award didn't sell as well as I thought it would, so let me put something else out for the year.
Yeah.
It didn't sell well then, but surprisingly, like in January, Blood Ties really started to kind of pick up
Oh,
again.
that's cool.
Eh, for sales. So, just kind of as I guess a lesson to other authors, if your book doesn't sell right away when you release it, which I understand that's a disappointing feeling. Everyone wants, to get on the bestseller list right away. Maybe just wait like, a couple months or even a year. Your work, can pick up traction at sometimes the weirdest times.
Hmm.
So,
I always think the cool thing about making books is that you have a product then to sell. You aren't it's not a one and done. Once it exists, it is out there. Unless you're
right.
doing the thing where you're ordering, like depending on who you work through, for if you're self-publishing, there's only so many copies literally made, then you're kind of more limited. But by and large, once you make it, it's out there. It's always got a chance to sell. And that's kind of the thing I think is really cool about having that finished product there on the shelf.
Yeah. Well, and I think the other thing too is like for me personally, because I do podcasting as well,
Hmm.
and one of the things that like I didn't really set it up this way as like an intention, but the one thing that's been really nice is most podcasters, and no shame to anyone who does this, but like a lot of podcasters will now like have Patreons or,
Hmm.
take your pick of like any, paywall,
Yeah.
subscription or membership or whatever. And I've tried that and it's like it's hard enough to put like,
Yes.
standard content out there enough as is. And then to paywall stuff is just like that's a whole nother ball wax. So the one thing that's been really nice is, if you want to support the show, just, buy a book or buy a book for someone else. And that's one thing that I've pushed. And, um, I think it's like worked out real well because I went from just doing a society and culture, podcast to also like now I'm doing what you do and interviewing other authors. So it's all
Mhm.
kind of tied, together nicely. So.
Segue and plug to the audience. If you haven't bought my book, One Man's Treasure, you can support the show by going out and getting yourself a copy along with Night of the Vigilante.
There you go. So, and
Uh,
one man's treasure is great, by the way.
Thank you. I appreciate it. It's a lot of fun. I'm working on the sequel right now, and it's fun to, as you know, writing serial fiction, getting to revisit characters that you really grew to like. It's fun to go back and inhabit their voices and mind again.
Yeah, so that's another thing too is so like with Blood Ties, I wrote it as like a one and done thing, right?
Hmm.
I wasn't really, even though it says volume one, like I was kind of like, okay, well, you know, after it so long, I'm like, okay, well, this was kind of this,
Experiment, doing something
yeah.
different.
And so initially I thought, okay, well, it didn't sell as well as, I've got other projects now. And now I'm getting ready to, release Night of the Vigilante and people are like, when is Blood Ties Part 2? And I'm like, oh, now you guys want Blood Ties Part 2.
Well, like when we talked with Eric Bishop on the show, mutual friend, he made a
Yeah.
really interesting observation that because he's got the Omega Group series and the Body Man series, on the face of it, they look like very similar types of ideas, but one is more uh, espionage government thriller and the other is more military thriller. And that doesn't seem
Yeah.
like a huge distinction, but it's a distinction enough that's two different audiences potentially and two different genres that he's writing in. So
Yeah.
he's diversified his portfolio, you might say.
Well, that's kind of the same thing with like Blood Ties and
Hmm.
then Shadows of Deception. Like
Yeah.
Shadows of Deception, because that was kind of my first, I guess, big debut. Like people think of me more as like the Ian Fleming,
Hmm.
spy thriller
Hmm.
genre guy, right? And so to be fair, I think when I released Blood Ties and it was, purely like crime fiction, which, I would say I grew up like reading as much like crime fiction as I did like Bond stuff. But I think for a
Hmm.
lot of people understandably, they were kind of like, okay, what's this? Like Sam's more of a spy,
Hmm.
and now he's writing about the mafia. Like I understand how like the change can be a bit jarring, but by the same token, like I seem to get like more praise from like other people as like a crime fiction writer than I do as spy. So I do both, and it's great.
Hmm.
So.
Talking about spy fiction, this is kind of like almost a segue of part two from when I was on your show. Literally, I feel like it was the day after the release of our interview on the Whitfield report that the announcement came that Amazon now has creative control over Eon Productions and James Bond. I'm curious, what are your thoughts on this massive change that has come in the Bond canon for films?
Well, I'm glad you asked this because I'm glad you asked that because I know you didn't ask this question, but part of the reason why I started writing Shadows of Deception was because of the up in the air nature of the Bond
Hmm.
series. So, um,
Which I have to give you high praise. Like, no shade to the several people that have written great James Bond fan fiction. Like, awesome, good for them. There's some on Instagram that do a great weekly installment of a James Bond story.
oh
That's neat,
yeah,
but they're using someone else's character rather than making their own. Which that's not to say that they can't do that, but I give you huge kudos on you created an original character and a story for yourself.
yeah. So my whole thing is after No Time to Die came out, like there was a lot of controversy over the
Hmm.
whole them killing Bond
Hmm.
off, and then is Bond going woke, or and stuff like that. And people kept asking me like how I would write James Bond,
Hmm.
and like I was like, well, I don't know. I'm not British, and I do feel like it
Yes.
would. I feel like Bond definitely should be British, but I'm like, okay, rather than me, um like writing just Bond fiction. Like I've had this story in the back of my head for at that point 10 years. I had just graduated college and I didn't really know like what I was gonna do. So I'm like, well, in the meantime, let me dig out this kind of old like short story that I had and rework it a bit. And so, that's kind of where Shadow of Deception came from. It was the first one is not perfect, and I've definitely like expanded upon it, but it's kind of like my American version of James Bond meets Mitch Rapp and whatnot.
Hmm.
As far as the future of Bond itself, um, it's tricky.
Hmm.
Um, because on the one hand, Amazon has done like really great adaptions of like the Harry Bosch series with Michael
Hmm.
Conley.
Hmm.
Up until like the last two seasons, then they kind
Hmm.
of went off the rails. They have good shows like, Bosch, and they did a good job with like The Terminalist, and um, they did well with Reacher
Hmm.
recently. But on the flip side, they have, Rings of Power, which is kind of
All the good, and then Rings of Power just drops the scale.
yeah. And I mean your immediate laugh to your immediate reaction of chuckling at that, that's kind of that's kind of everyone's reaction when Ring of Power. And there's a lot of like, rumor about, well, Barbara was forced to sell James Bond or something like that. So there's a lot of up in the air,
Hmm.
um, you know, uh, reaction. I'm kind of afraid, partially that like the kind of like the modern audience,
Hmm.
crowd is going to kind of get their hand on James Bond. But I'm also hoping that like Jeff Bezos being so like passionate that he'll actually like
Well,
be
did
like,
you hear that he's given like a edict to the Amazon studios and said James Bond must be British and male?
yeah.
So
Well,
at least there's that. Like we can at least say, well, the CEO has said this for what it is
yeah.
worth.
Can we? Can I swear on? Can I swear
Yes.
on the?
Oh, I'll
Okay.
have the explicit tag on it.
Okay. So fair enough. I think what I so in my mind I did see that and I was telling someone in the men's adventure fiction Discord I think what happened was Jeff Bezos he saw what happened with Rings of Power and was like at the next board meeting he was like, "Hey guys, remember what happened with Rings of Power? Yeah, we can't afford to fuck up the James Bond franchise. This way. People are mad enough with you know, the the Tolkien fans are, angry enough. We can't get the Fleming fans angry as well. So,
I saw the video. I don't know if you saw it. Analyze This, Mr. Bond. Ryan Holt did a little like his thoughts on the Amazon stuff. And he made a good point, which I hadn't thought of before. James Bond's only got 10 years before he hits the public domain. So there is a ticking clock on how long Amazon has the exclusive rights to make those movies. And so, like, I wonder how much that plays into their decisions for what they're going to do. Because either they can say, we can't mess this up because we've only got 10 years to milk this cash cow, or they're going to go, well, we've only got 10 years. Who cares? Let's give it a try. Let's do it whatever we want.
yeah, and that's weird. I thought that like the public domain was like every 90 years or something like that, but I guess it's changed.
It's changed a lot repeatedly over the last however many years just to try keeping Mickey Mouse from being a horror movie character. Well, that worked out well.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, it'll be interesting to see what they do with the Bond franchise. Like part of me, um, there's this whole argument that like Bond, there's really no way to modernize him. And people have
Hmm.
said that before, and I'm like, well, they said that back in the 80s, and then look
Yeah.
at how well, the Brosnan era, like it actually
Hmm.
worked out well. I think you could do modern James Bond, but like you would have to like really take your time with it.
Hmm.
And like I definitely think that like cyber terrorism, like yeah, you definitely could talk about something like that. I think something like Tomorrow Never Dies,
Hmm.
with the whole internet and misinformation, like back in 1997, that was kind of like people gave that like low marks because the plot was like real unrealistic. And now
Hmm.
it's like, well, Tomorrow Never Dies actually, in hindsight was kind of ahead of its time. So I
I would
think there
make an argument that's a highly underrated Bond film.
oh yeah, it's also I think of the three, I know people love GoldenEye and I
Hmm.
love GoldenEye as well, but like Tomorrow Never Dies, maybe it's because maybe because it was like the first one I saw, but that's kind of one of my favorites of
It's
the
also got a really good soundtrack. It's the first one with
oh
David
yeah.
Arnold, and there's no question the soundtrack is infinitely better than GoldenEye.
Yeah, GoldenEye like definitely has like you can definitely tell it's from the 90s because it kind of
Hmm.
has like that 90s synth vibe. Not necessarily bad, but like it definitely is of its era. Whereas like Tomorrow Never Dies, like yeah, you can tell because of the internet and whatnot that yeah, this is from the 90s, but it's a lot more timeless.
Hmm.
And so, like, I think there's an argument to take Bond back to the 60s, which is what people think. But, like, I don't know. I think you could also do a modern Bond. So
I've always been a big fan of the, I don't know if you've read any of the continuation novels,
I
but
have.
have you read the Benson continuation novels?
Yeah. Yeah. I really liked, I really liked,
Trigger
Trigger
Mortis?
Mortis.
Yeah.
With A Mind to Kill, I liked it, but the ending was kind of like, okay, so is this supposed to be like Bond's
Hmm.
final adventure, or you know,
I
uh,
I love the ambiguity of With a Mind to Kill. My reason for bringing Benson is simply that I think Benson's the perfect example of Bond feels a bit of an anachronism in the modern context, but you can write Bond where he's still a smoking, womanizing, drinking, hard agent who feels like he is from a different era, but slide him into the modern context to get the job done.
Yeah.
And that was the 90s. I mean, obviously things have changed even more into the 2020s, but I do think that there's a way to keep it requires good stories.
Well, I think even back in the 60s, someone brought this up to me when I recorded podcasts with them about a year ago. Even back in the 60s, Bond was kind of out of touch even then.
Yeah.
I believe
Hmm.
Sean Connery makes, Sean Connery's Bond, he makes
Yes.
like a comment about, oh, well, I need to wear earmuffs at 3 a.m. in the morning because those damn kids down the hall play the Beatles.
Start listening to the Beatles without earmuffs.
You're right, right. So yeah, it's like so even then, Bond's kind of a man from a different era, and I think that's kind of his
Hmm.
charm. And again, I don't think like yeah, I don't necessarily want I don't it's not that I don't think Bond is like a dinosaur, but I don't think Bond necessarily needs to be like hip,
No.
and necessarily
I think hip is the enemy of timeless.
yeah,
If you
well
look at
yeah,
any fiction, something that can choose, very few things are both. It is either timely or timeless. And very few things hit both sides. But hip is, I joke about this all the time. It's like when I hear contemporary Christian music and I'm like, you're trying to be cool. That's not the point. Stop trying to be cool.
it's when they try too
Yeah.
hard.
Don't, and we see this with a lot of Hollywood pictures today, appealing to let's try to, oh, people care about that. Let's care about that too. And you can make an argument the worst Bond plots in the films are ones where they're like, oh, this is the thing now that everyone will care about. And that's where they decide to plant the flag in the story. And you're like, oh, but that's not as interesting as, say, giant megalomaniac villain wants to blow up the world.
Yeah, and then those those trends that like go for like whatever is, hip, they age really poorly too. In like uh Moonraker, the movie is like a perfect example of that, right? If you look at Moonraker in the context of when it was released, like
Hmm.
they really were like trying to cash in on, Star Wars had just come out the year before, and they were really trying to cash in on the hype of that. Moonraker as a book is really good, but
Phenomenal.
I think now like people kind of look back at the Moonraker film and are like, Bond going into space, how laughable. And it's kind of like it's kind of the same thing. Whereas like GoldenEye, like,
Hmm.
yeah, it's of its time, but like you can kind of understand, okay, we're examining, post-war Europe after the Cold War. And
Hmm.
so it is very, I guess, timely, kind of,
Hmm.
you know, but like it's also kind of like timeless and like kind of explain what's going on in the world. So there's a way to balance it, I guess.
Hmm. I would be remiss if I didn't ask you about your writing process because you've maintained a fantastic output being a prolific writer of good stories. What do you do as a writing routine if you have one, or do you just kind of write as you go?
So a bit of both. So I try and write something every day.
Hmm.
That's also why I have multiple series, is because sometimes, sometimes I get really bored with like writing the Shadows of Deception stuff, so I'll write something in Blood Ties. Other days, vice versa. So my general thing is, and this might kind of be a bit controversial. So I just write my first drafts
Hmm.
kind of. Usually I have an outline of some sort that's not really an outline. It's just kind of ideas for the story I have.
Hmm.
And then I'll kind of pants the first chapter, right? Or the first couple.
Hmm.
And I'll put my clunky first drafts into Chat GPT and have them kind of refine it and kind of I guess edit and structure things.
Hmm.
So I've actually had this debate with several other writers because, and I don't know how you feel about this, but there's a whole big camp that like, oh, ChatGPT and AI in general is the enemy of, writing, and authors should never use it whatsoever, because it's not you writing, it's the AI that's writing things. And certainly, yeah, there are people who can just, be super lazy and,
Hmm.
plug in prompts, which I've done just for the heck of it to see like what it'll spit out, and it's always like crap. But if you have like a decent first draft or second draft
Hmm.
and you kind of use it to like refine and clean things up, it does it fairly well. So, in my experience. So I don't understand like why authors are so I feel like a lot of the people who are like just so vehemently anti-AI are the ones who haven't really played around with it properly.
Hmm.
Certainly, I think people can be over reliant on it, but I definitely think it can be helpful, just like spell check or
Hmm.
Grammarly can be.
I think
Um,
that's where I'm starting to lean towards using it is more for specifically editing because I hate grammar rules. It's not my thing. I do my best to write, and rather than trying to go through I think at this point, I find I've experimented with a few short stories, just giving it the document. This is what I've written. Please line
yeah,
edit for grammar. And it's done okay at that. But that's where I'm personally comfortable with using it right now. I think that's one of those things everyone's going to kind of find what they like to use it for and not.
yeah,
But that's everyone makes those decisions, is where I always land on
yeah.
questions that even look close to controversial.
Or I'll say something like, hey, can you polish this, dialogue up a bit, or, make this fight scene like more intense, or, something like that. Or, you know, what would, a typical weapon be, for this type of, person to use? Oh, okay. Can you add that into the story? So it's not like I'm just sitting
Hmm.
and
You're not feeding
um
it, this is the plot, spit out entire story.
right. I'm putting information in there, yes, but I'm constantly like putting information in there to improve it. It would be like working with an editor,
Hmm.
only, only like it'll learn your style too, which is really nice too, like the more you work with it. So again, like, do I think that, everyone should use? No, I'm not saying that either. I think it's choice, but I think those who can use it properly,
Hmm.
like for me, it's definitely helped with like, cutting down like I feel like I can get more writing done as opposed to like, just proofreading and like
Hmm.
editing endlessly. And also, like I'm sorry to say this too, because I know that there are good editors out
Hmm.
there who do it manually, and I do have people who proofread it, but who do proofread my work as humans. But like, I'm sorry, I'm not gonna pay like $500 on Fiverr for someone to edit my novella. That's way too costly. And yeah, it's a lot cheaper for me to pay $20 a month, to use ChatGPT. And so, yeah, like what I do is I just simply, you know, like I said, I put my first draft into ChatGPT, and then I manually refine it, and then I have people just read and give
Hmm.
feedback, and I make adjustments there too.
Hmm.
So
I'm curious, when you have beta readers, how much the reason I ask this is because I remember there was a Neil Gaiman quote that was like, when people tell you that something doesn't work for them, they're always right. When they tell you how to fix it, they're always wrong. How much of when you get beta reader feedback do you incorporate?
um I incorporate I incorporate like a fair I incorporate like a fair amount of it. Some of it is like you have to be really careful too
Hmm.
with beta readers too because some beta readers it's not that they're bad, they're all good, but like some beta readers will be like I don't like this character and they're stupid like they're not really like helping to proofread. They're just giving their, critique on like what the story is. And sometimes like I'll ask why, and it's like, okay, well that's interesting to consider, but I am keeping this detail and I know, like one of the things for Night of the Vigilante is there are lots of torture scenes
Mm.
in there. And someone was like, yeah, this is too gratuitous and it makes me uncomfortable. And it's like, well, I can't really take that out because we're dealing with cartel violence. And
Hmm.
unfortunately for better or for worse, like, you know, cartel people do mutilate, civilians and they do cut off people's heads. But like I think for the most part, most of the beta readers I have, they are really good at just like being like, okay, you could tidy this up. I see a couple of spacing errors here and there and whatnot. So,
Hmm. Sam, this has been a delightful conversation. Where can people go to get Night of the Vigilante when it's out and your greater world of literature and content?
well, I really appreciate you having me on. You can find, I'm at a couple places. You can find all my books on Amazon. Just type in Sam Whitfield and I think I am the first result to pop up. So, Night of the Vigilante comes out March 25th. I believe it will be out by the time this episode airs. So, it'll be available in paperback, ebook, and Audible format as well.
Ooh, cool.
Um, you can you can also find Blood Ties on Amazon as well. People ask me about the audiobook for that. That's gotten delayed, but hopefully that will come out like later this summer. And then Shadows of Deception books 1 through 3 are available there, and there's a hardcover compendium as well. So,
Sweet.
and just one more thing too, if people could just for any author too, just it always helps when you give us feedback, but it also really helps when you leave any author like a review on Amazon too.
Hmm.
And you can also follow me on Twitter, or I guess it's called X now, at @SamDiver_NGC. And tune into the Whitfield for my podcast on Spotify as well. So
Awesome. And we will link all of that in the show notes. Sam, thanks again for coming on the show.
no problem, man. Thanks for having me.